Welcome to the EDAM Access Charge Tariff and Review Stakeholder Call. My name is Yelena Coppola-Alford, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs here at California ISO, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. We're going to go over a couple of housekeeping reminders before I hand it over. So the call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you need technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer. Today's event producer is Stacy. To raise your hand, if you connected to the audio through your computer or use the call me option, select the raised hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you dialed in outside of the WebEx, you can select #2 on your computer to get it on your phone to get into the queue. And please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment so we know who's speaking. And you can send your questions in the chat, either to all panelists or to me. My name is Yelena. Our agenda for today, I'm going to hand it over to Milos and John for some introductions. Then Milos is going to go over the overview for the access charge, and then it's actually going to be Bill Weaver that's going to walk us through the tariff language. And then we're going to go back to John for next steps. So I'm going to hand it over to Milos here.
Yeah, actually, I'll give a few introductory remarks, and then Milos will give a walkthrough of the proposal. So I think most all of you will recall, but I'll just refresh everyone's recollection a little bit. This transmission revenue requirement, or EDAM access charge, was proposed in our August 22nd filing of the DAME and EDAM proposals that included the entire suite of proposals. We went through that process, and in December 20, the Commission issued an order accepting, all of the elements of DAME and EDAM subject to a compliance filing, except for the EDAM access charge, which they rejected without prejudice. So this presentation today and discussion today is to review that proposal so everyone, recalls what it was all about, and then to walk through the tariff language, which we've, I'd say, refined in a few places to pick up and respond to some of the guidance that we received from the Commission in its order. But essentially, we are proposing to resubmit or refile. It's actually a new filing, but refile the original proposal. So this process, as you can see, is to review that tariff language and to refresh everyone's recollection on the proposal, but not to revisit the underlying proposal. We are moving ahead in reliance on the original approval by the governing body and board back in February of 2023, and we'll be filing essentially the same proposal with, like I said, a few refinements we'll walk through today, and being very responsive to all of the Commission's guidance and questions that they had in the December 20 order. Given this opportunity, I think, and we expect everyone to see, at least when the submission is made, a great deal more, explanation and clarification of all the elements of this EDAM access charge design. So I guess with that, I'll see if anyone has any just, background questions sort of on where we are and what we're planning to do before I turn it over to Milos for a refresh on the proposal. All right. Well, as always, you're welcome to raise your hand throughout and use the chat feature to inquire about anything that comes to mind. But at the moment, we'll move on with the overview. Milos?
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. And I apologize, the sun is hitting my window right providing that glare, but it should go away here in a couple of minutes. And good morning, and again, appreciate everybody joining us today. I'm going to provide, as John said, an overview of the EDAM access charge as a refresher and to contextualize the tariff language that Bill is going to go through shortly. And as John said, this was a design that we developed together in 2022 as we were working on the overall EDAM structure, and that was approved by the ISO Board of Governors and the EDAM governing body in February of 2023, and that we subsequently filed earlier in or mid-2023. So as John said, we're not proposing substantive changes to the design, but this is a walkthrough kind of as a refresher to help everybody kind of get up to or remember where we landed on this particular aspect. So starting on this slide 5, as a starting point, think what is the function and what's the purpose of the EDAM access charge? It's an important component of the overall design, but why is that? And so through our design discussions back in 2022, there was recognition that market participation may reduce the sale of certain transmission products or change the patterns in the use of these transmission products across a particular EDAM area. We don't know what the impact of the market may be on those sales. We don't have that actual operational practice or experience, but we do recognize the potential for reduced transmission revenues or transmission sales. And so the EDAM design therefore introduced mechanisms to provide for recovery of historical transmission revenues to mitigate or avoid cost shifts between different types of transmission customers on a system or across the different systems that may participate in the EDAM. There was a recognition that cost shifts between transmission customers may be inappropriate as a condition to joining a broader day-ahead market and may in fact create some disincentives to participating in a market. And a transmission provider who may see meaningful reductions in their transmission revenues that then lead to cost shifts between their native load and other transmission customers in the context of wholesale transmission rates, in the context of creation of those wholesale transmission rates that provide for recovery of the cost of the system, they may not see as a benefit those cost shifts, in fact, a disincentive to that market participation. And so with that context, and why it was important to introduce the EDAM access charge as part of the overall design, we see that access charge that I'm going to cover over the next few slides is an important element of the overall EDAM picture and a permanent part of that design at the onset of the EDAM. We haven't proposed a predefined sunset period for these provisions or for the structure of that design, and we expect that with operational experience, we will have the ability to evolve that design as we monitor and report out on its implementation and functioning. And I'm going to cover that aspect, the transparency, the reporting, and the monitoring in a later slide. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I want to just briefly provide an overview then of the different design elements to contextualize ultimately what we'll be refiling with FERC with additional explanation and clarification, and John said, as you'll see a bit later. There are 3 components to that EDAM access charge design. There's the recovery associated with the historical transmission revenues prior to joining EDAM for short-term firm and non-firm transmission sales, and for the ISO in the context of the wheeling access charge revenues pre-EDAM. The second element is recovery associated with a portion of new transmission upgrades costs that increase the transfer capability between EDAM areas that ultimately support benefits across the footprint through optimization of that transmission by increasing that transfer capability. And then the third element is recovery of transmission costs associated with net wheel-through transfers across an individual EDAM area, where the EDAM entity's transmission system may support or may have supported more transfers wheeling through its system for the wider benefit of the EDAM footprint. And this would provide compensation for recognition of those benefits and the use of that transmission system. So these are the primary three components that make up the overall structure of that EDAM access charge, and I'm going to go briefly over each one of those elements here in the subsequent slides. So if we can go, there we go, slide 7. The first component, that component one is that's recoverable. It's associated with recovery of historical transmission revenues. There's a recognition that the EDAM design depends upon transmission to support optimization, efficient optimization, and derivation of those benefits. And there are different ways that transmission is made available to the market to optimize, including from, for example, unsold ATC that the transmission provider makes available for optimization. And then as well as unscheduled transmission capacity or capability that's not otherwise scheduled by the time that the market runs. The market can optimize that as well. All of which of these have the potential to reduce revenues for the transmission provider associated with those products that are currently now available to the market to support transfers for the benefit of all EDAM participants. Additionally, the market may ultimately change and affect how short-term transmission is procured. So these are all elements that create some of that uncertainty that we wanted to protect for and provide for the ability to recover through the EDAM design. Under this component, an EDAM entity is able to provide for recovery of historical transmission revenues associated with short-term firm and non-firm transmission sales under the OAT, and for the ISO, it's the wheeling access charge revenues, all of which may be foregone, or some portion of that may be foregone or result in reductions as a result of market participation, broader market participation in the day-ahead market. What is recoverable is based upon those pre-EDAM historical averages of revenues and sale associated with the products that we just talked about. Transmission providers are going to continue to sell transmission, short-term transmission under their OAT, and the ISO will continue to collect the wheeling access charge. But the intent is to keep the transmission provider whole to the 3-year average of those revenues associated with the products prior to joining EDAM. And as well as part of that process, if some of you may recall, there's an annual true-up to keep the EDAM entity whole to that pre-EDAM 3-year average of revenue. So there's an establishment of that 3-year average, what that recoverable amount is, an entity that estimates what may be at risk as a result of EDAM, and as they continue selling transmission, for example, in the OAT context, as they continue selling those short-term transmission products under the OAT that they continue to manage in an EDAM, and what the revenues they may receive from the EDAM for what they expected to forego, there's a true-up at the end of the year that looks at, did you recover between all of those components, your OAT sales and what you may receive through the EDAM, did you recover enough to cover those pre-EDAM 3-year average of historical revenues? So that's component 1. Let's go do an overview of component 2 on the next slide, slide 8. So that second component of the EDAM access charge design provides for recovery for a portion of transmission upgrades that, as I mentioned, increase the transfer capability between EDAM areas. New transmission facilities and investments can increase the ability to transfer energy between EDAM areas and increase transfers and derive those benefits for the wider EDAM footprint. This is an element that FERC also sought some additional explanation on, particularly on the methodology associated with this element 2. And similar to element 1, as we discussed earlier, the short-term revenues that are recoverable, transmission providers may not see certain short-term sales of transmission associated with new projects that may come online and may come into the picture. And that transmission may indeed support efficient EDAM transfers associated with that new upgrade. Therefore, a portion of those upgrades that otherwise would have contributed to deriving short-term revenues for that transmission provider outside of the market is recoverable through the EDAM. And the portion of the upgrade that's recoverable through the EDAM is based on looking at historically what proportion of the total annual transmission revenue requirement of a transmission provider is made up by short-term transmission sales. And so the particular formula looks at what's the historical pre-EDAM 3-year average of short-term sales of those products, and then it's divided by the historical pre-EDAM 3-year average of the annual transmission revenue requirement, and that derives a ratio, for example, 5% representing the proportion, if that ratio is 5%, that represents the proportion of short-term transmission sales that are part of the total annual transmission requirement. That 5% of that project cost is recoverable through the EDAM. And as we noted, consistent with element 1, these are the revenues, the short-term revenues. Those are the revenues that are potentially at risk in the EDAM. If we go to the next slide, please. So finally, the third component is associated with the net EDAM wheel-through transfers. Wheel-through transfers across individual EDAM balancing areas that are participating in the EDAM. EDAM areas, I think as we've experienced in the EIM as well, but depending on the time of year, conditions in the footprint, and location of that particular area within the footprint, EDAM areas may at times support more wheel-through transfers than import-export transfers, or wheel-through transfers in excess of the total net transfers. That means that at times, an EDAM area's transmission system may support more efficient EDAM transfers wheeling through its transmission system and supporting derivation of benefits for the rest of the participants in the footprint above and beyond their import-export transfers and the benefits that they may derive themselves. And so through the design, and in those instances, through the design discussions that we had back then, we felt that as a stakeholder community that it's appropriate to compensate the transmission provider for use of their transmission system in that particular instance to support those net wheel-through transfers at the hourly non-firm transmission rate applicable under the individual loads and at the WAC, wheeling access charge for the ISO. So this is an area, this element 3, this is an area of further explanation that FERC requested on this particular element, specifically on the justification and the use of the hourly non-firm transmission rate for compensation in those instances under the O, when that EDAM system may be utilized to support incremental net wheel-through transfers. And the rationale for that particular element is that this is the transmission product that is pro forma under the O, meaning every transmission provider has that product, an hourly non-firm product, whereas not every transmission provider may have a firm hourly product. So we chose that hourly non-firm product because it's common across the different OATs in the West, open access transmission tariffs in the West. Additionally, it's also prevalent practice in the West that the firm and the non-firm hourly rates are the same rate for those transmission products, to the extent that the transmission provider offers both of those products under their tariff. So that's the rationale for picking that particular rate, because it's common across all the tariffs or all the OATs across the West, and it's an hourly product with an hourly rate that even for those that do have both firm and non-firm products, the rates are the same. So let me go to the next slide, slide 10. I think that's the last substantive slide, and then we'll pause for questions after this before getting into the tariff. But those 3 elements that I covered earlier, those are the 3 components of the design that inform the establishment of the individual balancing area rates, which are ultimately, and those costs, and those are recoverable and allocated among EDAM entities on a load ratio share basis based on gross load. And an important consideration and underpinning of the entire design is robust transparency into the data and robust transparency into the inputs that support that establishment of the EDAM access charge. EDAM entities will ultimately be responsible for gathering the necessary information and submitting that supporting information to the ISO consistent with their FERC-approved rates, and that will support the derivation of the different components of the design. For example, the 3-year average of the historical revenues. We expect entities to provide that, and that's based on their FERC-approved rates and data that supports the establishment of those rates. They will also provide estimations of forecasts of foregone revenues and information that ultimately supports the annual true-up calculation. So all this information is going to be provided by the EDAM entity, and that information will be attested to by the submitting entity and will be posted publicly on the ISO website so that market participants have access to it for purposes of review, and that information is also going to support subsequent review and reporting to help support evolution of the design. But moreover, each year prior to setting the individual rates for recovery of estimated foregone revenues, the ISO is going to hold a stakeholder meeting to review the information that's submitted by the different transmission providers of the EDAM entities, to review that information that's posted publicly, and also share the resulting rates that are derived based on that information that's provided. And the intent there is, again, to provide additional transparency, but also setting some expectations so that entities know what to expect in the next year based on the data collected across the EDAM footprint. These discussions, I think, can also be leveraged to report out on the operational experience of this particular design element, as well as evaluate the structure and effectiveness of the design that we put in place. But separate from that, the ISO and the EDAM entities will also actively monitor the effectiveness of the design. I think it's in the interest of each EDAM entity to review and make sure that what they're receiving and recovering is ultimately meeting the intended objectives of the design. Whether it's that reporting is going to, and that monitoring is going to look at, is the design meeting the intended goals, as we noted earlier? Is it mitigating those cost shifts? Is it avoiding those cost shifts between different transmission customers? What's the impact of the market on transmission revenues that parties may see associated with those short-term products, and any other experiences that ultimately may inform the impacts and potential evolution of the design. We're going to also establish a comprehensive report in conjunction with the EDAM entities at the time based on that operational experience. And we're giving ourselves no later than 3-year operational experience that we're going to provide a report, and it could be earlier than that depending on what impacts we're seeing, but that we were going to put that comprehensive report to understand the effectiveness of the design with those initial participants. And that operational experience, the monitoring, the different reports in the annual reviews, working closely with the EDAM entities will help inform those enhancements or any necessary enhancements or evolution of design beyond this initial starting point that we described in the design and that was approved by our board in 2023. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a refresher on the purpose, the structure, and some of the transparency aspects and reporting on that are going to inform review and evolution of that design. We recognize that this is an important component of the overall design. I think you're going to see more description of this and discussion of this in more depth in our transmittal letter once we do the filing, responding to the FERC request for additional explanation and information on the different components. But hopefully this overview helped refresh some of the recollection and sets a little bit of the context then for the incremental tariff red lines that we're going to be going over shortly. But let me pause here now that we've gone through the substantive slide deck. Let me pause here and open it up for any kind of questions or clarifications before we get into the tariff language.
We do have a couple of hands up. Dan Williams is first.
Please go ahead.
Hey, good morning, Milos. This is Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. So I'm going to ask for some refresher a little bit further back to some of the policy decisions going back to the setup for this from the EDAM policy a couple of years ago. So the focus on WAC versus TAC on the CAISO side, Can you remind me why the decision was made to go with WAC revenues versus TAC? From kind of memory, TAC is charged to exports from the CAISO system that are using the intertie market for day ahead and hour ahead exports from CAISO, and it feels as though that would be a relevant source of collection for the ISO. And also, when looking at that, I know there's both a high voltage and a low voltage look at both TAC and WAC. And just kind of, can you refresh why we went with WAC instead of TAC on this?
Yeah, I'll start, and then James, Lynn, maybe you can help me supplement anything that I leave off in terms of the distinctions between the WAC and the TAC. But in short, I think the wheeling access charge is the transmission charge that we apply to our wheel through and export transactions across our system for entities that are effectively utilizing that system. So that's why we relied on that charge as compared to the TAC, which are, I think, the same rate. But let me see, James, if you're on, if you wanted to highlight any further distinctions.
Yeah, let's we need to break it down a little bit. So TAC is made up of two basically different charge codes. One is access charge, which high voltage access charge, low voltage access charge, that is collected from load. And then you have the wheeling access charge, which can be both on high voltages and low voltage as well. So TAC is split between those two elements, so the HVAC charge is how we refer to it as in acronyms, is collection from load, whereas the WAC charge is the collection from exports. So we're focusing on TAC, but we're specifically focusing on the wheeling access charge because that represents our collection of transmission access from exports in the ISO BAA.
So just to make sure I'm understanding that, so it's kind of mapping down into the settlements work that's done to isolate both the wheeling activity and the say incremental export activity that's happening with the CAISO intertie market, but it's picking those up as WAC, even though we see and hear often that TAC is what is charged to those exports?
Yeah, so TAC is the overall umbrella.
Okay, and WAC within the umbrella.
Correct.
Okay. And so it's picking up depending on which intertie point you're leaving from on the CAISO system. It's picking up either the high voltage or both the high voltage and low voltage, as it's depending on sort of where you're impacting the system.
Correct.
And from just then kind of moving forward, the next question I had is into the 3-year look back. So with the new TSMSP policy, there's a sort of new pool of entities that may be looking to reserve high priority wheel throughs, and by doing so are going to be charged the WAC on a going forward or prepaid basis, because now currently they would just be paying it when used, but in the future it's paying it when reserved. That could be a meaningful increase in volume. That will get picked up that increase in volume would get picked up in the 3-year rolling forward. So as we're doing this for the first year for EDAM, it's going to start to pick up that new TSMSP-based driver for an increase in WAC volume. Is that a decent way of looking at it?
Yeah, so the TSMP to the priority wheel through settlement on WAC, that is going to be included in the consideration when we go live. When we go live, we'll start to look back period from there. What we'll look at is do we foresee that we are going to lose some of that revenue as well, because the way it's going to settle, and we're in the process of implementing it right now, is that the wheeling access charge is going to be based on the higher of your usage or what your purchase of the priority wheel through quantity. And so we'll take that into consideration when we are implementing this 3-year look back.
Okay, and so to drill down on that, just kind of hypothetically, let's say we're in 2028 and the EDAM footprint is PacifiCorp, SMUD, LDWP, and maybe 1 or 2 others, but doesn't include the entire EIM area. So there still is wheel-through activity happening from, say, Palo to Mid-C going through the CAISO system. What you'd be trying to isolate for in this specific instance is changes that have happened because of EDAM taking place with the footprint that it has, not, and so trying to maybe isolate that from ongoing WAC activity that would be happening still within the market. Is that a correct way of thinking about it?
Yeah, what we're trying to do is we'll get an idea of what the overall 3-year average of our WAC revenue is, and then from there we'll go into and trying to identify what we believe is going to be converted basically to EDAM usage, and so we'll estimate what we believe the foregone WAC revenue is going to be. So obviously, since we don't have all the inner ties associated with the ISO, joining all at once, we'll have to be more selective on how we determine that. And we kind of went through that in the ISO BA rules. We may have to revisit that, or depending upon FERC's ruling on this. But ultimately, yes, that's what we will be doing.
Okay, and then last question is just around the transmission upgrades process of this. Can you remind me kind of where projects like the subscriber PTO for Transwest, or looking forward with the SWIP North project that was kind of conditionally given a thumbs up by the board back in December, sort of, do any of those costs make their way in as transmission upgrades that would be levelized through the EDAM access charge?
So yes, what we'll do is we will make an evaluation. This is the component 2. When you have new transmission, we will look at that transmission and see if it adds any transfer capability between those BAAs that are joining. If it'll provide some transfer capability, we'll look to see what their annual TRR is, and then we call basically a guesstimate in essence. I don't want to use the word guesstimate, but an estimate based upon what the ISO's current usage is. So we'll take, in essence, what we've foregone as WAC revenue compared to our total annual transmission revenue requirement to get a percentage, and then we apply that percentage to that new transmission. And then from there, we'll start looking to, as we get more experience in there, is see if we have to adjust up or down on that percentage for that new transmission.
Okay, that makes sense. And then that also applies to upgrades that are within the approved within the TPP already, but that would be impacting transfer capability between the EDAM areas and the CAISO BA. So could we kind of go through that list of approved and ongoing projects and identify, like, I'm just going to pull something out of the hat, like an upgrade going on at Round Mountain that would impact, say, Malin transfer capability, may have some portion that should get allocated into this charge because it's an upgrade that's helping transfers?
Yes, we will look at each individual project associated with that. If it increases the transfer capability, we will look at the cost of what's going to be included in the annual transmission revenue requirements that we file with FERC, and we'll make a distinction as to how much of that needs to be included in this recovery versus how much we believe is going to go to load, in essence, or to non-EDAM interties. So we will be going through it, but we will be looking at it more as when it becomes active and it's energized, and we are now going to be able to use it as a scheduling point. At that point, we will take that consideration and whether or not to add it to our recovery amount.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I guess the last question is just, if this is being kind of done as an ongoing report for transparency, is there an effort to kind of look at what it would be now if we were sort of doing that now with the known footprint of PacifiCorp and SMUD as the first entrance, and kind of what's known as the CAISO TRR and WAC and as it exists today? Or is it kind of we aren't going to get that until year one of EDAM, then we'll see what the sort of dollars at risk is for this effort?
We are taking a preliminary look at it, more along the line to do some analysis to improve how we're going to go through this process. But it isn't really going to become finalized until we get closer to year one, to when we get actually to the point where I have to start settling on it. So, I recently looked back to see what 2024 or 2023, 2022, and 2021, but I know it's going to change because of 2024 scheduling. So we will I'll keep looking at it, but the finalized numbers will be closer to year one.
Great. Thank you for taking all the time to run through that. It's very helpful to get a few more of the details filled in, since it's been a little while since those EDAM working groups a few years ago.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And just to follow up on what James noted as well, and I think we made this commitment as well in our prior transmittal as well, but that will, particularly prior to that year one, we're going to have a broader stakeholder process to put all those numbers on the table and walk through them with stakeholders. What do things look like prior to year one? So it's going to be a stakeholder aspect of the process prior to launch. Okay, I think I see, is it Dorland?
Yeah, Kanya is our next hand. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I wanted to go back to, thank you for this presentation and update. And I wanted to go back to page 8, where you talk about component 2, the transmission upgrade compensation. And just wanted to ask, I thought I heard you say that only 5% of transmission upgrades would be reimbursed, or that's the formula. And just wanted to know what that was based on.
Sorry, I think I said, for example, if that ratio comes out at 5%, the ratio, I just use the 5% as an example. Whatever this ratio ends up being, I think based on what we've heard and when we've gone through that stakeholder process back in 2022, I think, the percentages, the estimations at least varied, somewhere higher than 10% could be in that ballpark. But ultimately, this is a entity by entity determination of what proportion of your annual transmission requirement is made up by short-term product sales. And when we'll use that ratio, the 5% was an example to illustrate, what this may look like.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And then I think we have Bert. And Bert, if you're trying to, oh, there we go.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. This is Bert Hansen with Edison. I'm interested in the component 3 example on page 9, and I'm not sure I understand the middle bullet talking about what component 3 is looking at, and what an example would be of wheel-through transfers in EDAM net of import-export transfers, which I think is key to understanding this whole component. So could you provide an example of that?
Yeah. Let me see here. James has looked at some of this data in the context of the EIM as well, and maybe James, do you want to provide an illustrative example of what this determination looks like?
I'll describe it at a high level, but illustrative is a little bit too quick to do on the fly. But in essence, every BAA, we look at what its net transfer capability is. And so when the market's dispatching it, it's going to look to say, okay, they have this much generation coming in or out of, or supply coming in and out of that BAA, and that becomes the overall BAA net. What this is going to do is we're going to look at each individual transfer location, and we are going to look to see what the net at those transfer locations are. We're going to basically sum it up and say, what is my net exports for that BAA versus net imports? If the net exports exceed the net imports, that amount that is in excess is in essence considering wheeling through. Whereas the portion that, if it's net imports exceeds the net exports, we are having energy come in to that BAA. So therefore, we wouldn't have any collection of costs here. And so the whole purpose is to try to capture the market usage of the transfers in relationship to how much we're using these transfers in excess of prior years, or prior to entering into EDAM.
Okay, so there is a historic component to it. It's not just an ongoing evaluation of what's happening right now.
Starting year one, since we don't have any transfers in day ahead, we are basically starting at 0, and so then we will start calculating it from there.
Okay, and does this maybe get a little bit into the network aspect of EDAM entities versus just path-specific use of pre-EDAM OAT exports, imports use? Or
yeah, so
not understanding that.
Yeah, so what's happening is we may have a little bit of overlap here with component 1, but what we're trying to do is, as the market is optimizing it, the transmission, you're going to have the use of the transmission change over time. You're not having people bidding in at the interties in order to export out energy. And so what this is to capture is more of the excess use by the market than what was normally used using the import-export bids. So we're trying to capture as much as we can through component 1, which is the import-export bids, how much is being transitioned into use of the EDAM transfers, and then component 3 says, okay, now that the market has used it, what does that use look like? And if we are exporting out more than we're importing in, then we need to compensate for that excess export.
Okay, I think I'm getting closer to understanding. I think one of my concerns has always been that there not be an overlap between component 3 and component 1, where component 1 is basically compensating for pre-EDAM revenues. And finally, I'm just also curious about whether the justification for component 3 is in any way based on benefits that such entities that are performing or providing more wheel-throughs than other EDAM entities should receive more based on the benefits they provide rather than just cost recovery.
That's right, Bert. I mean, it's, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Milo.
Was that you?
I was actually going to kick it to you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the overall concept and how we came up with this element was a recognition that in those instances where they have those incremental net EDAM transfers that are wheeling through the EDAM balancing area, there was a recognition that the system of that balancing area is providing benefits in terms of transfers for the entire footprint, because that system is being used to wheel through those transfers across their area. So providing benefits for the rest of the footprint and maybe not itself through those incremental net transfers. And there was a recognition that in those instances where that system is located in that particular area where it's being used to support benefits through the transfers to everybody else, that those incremental net wheel through transfers, that use of transmission should be compensated because it was being used to support benefits to everybody else in excess of the benefits that they may have derived themselves through the different transfers that we're importing or exporting from the system.
Okay, thank you. That's my questions.
Yeah, thank you, Bert. Then I think we have Siddle.
Producer, can you unmute Sybil? Okay, Sybil, go ahead.
Hey guys, good morning. Thanks for this review. This is really helpful. This is Sybil from PGP. Quick question on the 3-year look back. That is based on the 3 years leading up to each entity's individual go live date, or is that the same date for all participants regardless of when they join?
No, good question. It's based on each individual entity's joining date. So prior to that individual entity joining the EDAM, what was your historical average of sales across those prior three years?
Okay, so potentially introducing a sort of first mover benefit there. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
That's all the hands we had.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Then we'll switch now to Bill to walk through the tariff language, incremental edits, and then we'll come back to the subject to talk about just some of the next steps that we'll cover. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Milos and James, for those walkthroughs. Let's see. Can anyone could chime in and make sure they can see this and hear me? I would appreciate it. Then I'll get going.
Okay, I can see that.
Okay, and I would note for you who are, not day in and day out on WebEx, that you yourself have the ability to kind of zoom in on my document at the top of your screen, and zoom out. I understand, walking through the draft tariff language can often be an experience in nausea as we scroll quickly, but bear with me. I will note here that, we didn't re-solicit, formal comments on the iterative draft tariff revisions. I think we sought comments and stakeholder these about 4 times, and we only had minor revisions on top of what we already did. But that said, if you have specific tariff concerns, comments, questions, please feel free to reach out to me or Milos or John at the CAISO individually. We're happy to talk through them or consider anything, but we would ask you to do so very very quickly as we prepare for this filing. So what we're looking at here, anything in black is already approved by FERC and therefore, static. The red line tariff revisions you'll see are the same as what we proposed before in stakeholdered. Anything highlighted in yellow is the iteration, the changes we're seeing now. So, Friday, we've stakeholdered these a bunch. I'm not going to go through everything again. I'm really going to focus on the iterative changes on this call, but please, anyone stop or raise questions if you have them. I don't have quite the ability to see when I'm sharing my screen. So if anyone can stop me and let me know that there's a question, I'm happy to go. But we'll go through everything quickly and then we can go back to any section because it's not that much. So we're looking at the implementation activities. This is approved. This is a different section than the rest of the access charge, 33.2.5. You'll note the only thing that deals with the access charge here is this requirement, which is that the EDAM entity provides the information and documentation necessary to start analyzing and then computing the access charge prior to its go live. This piece we would ask for FERC to find effective far earlier, consistent with the rest of the implementation activities, so that we have it prior, whereas the rest of the access charge, similar to the previous filing, would be effective at go live. So here you're only seeing a couple of changes, neither of which change anything substantively from a policy perspective or even really a tariff perspective. One, and you'll see this throughout, we've changed the term transmission revenue recovery just to historical revenue recovery. And that's simply because transmission revenue recovery has a specific definition already in the CAISO tariff, referring to those complete transmission revenue requirements for our CAISO participating transmission owners. That transmission revenue recovery goes into the transmission access charge and the wheeling access charge. And we just want to avoid confusion. We're just creating two terms for two different things, but there was no real policy change there. The second kind of little change you're seeing is you'll see some when we filed this previously, we were filing the access charge based on the EDAM entities only because the ISO BAA filing was going to succeed the EDAM filing. Now, so we wanted to keep those separate for FERC's consideration. Now you'll see, and avoid a reconciliation filing, now you'll see some of that reconciliation where some of the relevant CAISO BAA language sneaks into the tariff. And this is more about that the CAISO is also going to share its data for the access charge. It'll be both ways. I'll pause here. I think Bonnie Blair had I think I quickly saw her hand go up if she had a question on this or just tariff overall.
Producer, can you unmute Bonnie, please? Bonnie, go ahead.
Bill, it's Bonnie Blair for the Six Cities Group.
Hi, Bonnie, go ahead.
Hi. If you look at the third line of this, you've got a wording glitch here.
Oh, you're right.
I'm not quite sure how to fix it. Maybe just strike exchange, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's actually strike provides, so that it's because that's what's happening. The CAISO and the EDAM entity are exchanging the data for the access charge. But yeah, good catch there.
That works. Note. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll have you take it. All right, proceeding down. Again, here, this is just, again, keeping terms separate. saying here. Now we're getting into, so we leave 33 to 33.1. We're getting into the bulk of the access charges is in 33.26. These initial sections are somewhat overview before getting into the specifics of each component. These are all described consistent with how Neelish and James walked through them. Not much changed here. That's a simple typo correction, plural and singular. Here in component 3 again, you see, as I said before, that you see that CAISO BEA simply get mentioned, but this is not a policy change in any case. And then again, I think we're providing. We wanted to. This was in the transmittal letter and specified throughout the policy. It might have been a little ambiguous in the tariff, so we were specifying the rate. I guess the rate was in the tariff originally. We're just moving this around for clarity, but providing the CAISO PTO rate and the EDM transmission service provider rate for this third component. Again, no substantive changes. This is just reconciling the ISO BAA rules were put in and adding that here. Here we see, again, no real policy or substantive changes, but we wanted to provide more detail here in the tariff rather than kind of defer to the business practice manual. Now, obviously, the tariff, we don't have to. We can always provide examples. We can always provide guidance through the business practice manual, whether we call it out in the tariff or not. But we didn't want to imply that, oh, this is all going to be dealt with in the business practice manual. No tariff requirements. There were quite a bit of tariff requirements already, and we've shored this up additionally. So some of the iterative changes you see is, one, we think it's prudent for us and for everyone that every single year the EDM transmission owners, the EDM entities, would be providing the data that they're going to submit to us to compute the EDM access charges by July 1st. This provides sufficient time for us to post everything on the CAISO website for stakeholder, local regulatory authority, market participant, anyone who wants to review can review everything that was provided and call in a question or challenge anything as it may be. It gives plenty of time for those processes to have out, as well as, the whole idea of this is that sunshine is the best disinfectant, transparency, we all see what's going into the rate. To that effect too, we memorialize that we will publish all the supporting documentation on the CAISO website. We also added this provision that says all data provided must be sufficiently granular to enable verification of the EDM access charge by the CAISO and market participants. So the idea here is making sure this is not supposed to be a sort of a black box. Obviously, all the inputs to the EDM access charge are coming from these transmission owners' approved rate cases. However, we want to see the breakdown and the justification for each individual component, again, so everyone can review and ensure that we're properly aligning costs with benefits. Other than that, you see amount added to TRUB just as make it a little less colloquial. CAISO website is a defined term, so this was capitalized, but otherwise no changes here. Here's an exception to everything I've said before, which is this is new. This is within the existing policy of defining what the exit from the EDM may look like. But we thought it's probably good to provide some clarity within that policy on how the access charge specifically would work, especially where if an EDM transmission owner is leaving mid-year, the access charge, the EDM access charges, just like the transmission access charges, are really designed to compute, over a year and be that annual collection. And so we didn't want to either have the EDM transmission owner feel like it's being, getting a punitive penalty for leaving that will harm its ratepayers. We also don't want to leave the transmission owner ratepayers who have allocated to the EDM excess charge, left holding the bag because someone has left. They also need to be made whole. On the other hand, you can't collect forever after someone has left, so we needed to provide a firm cutoff for when the calculations stop. So just as we already had approved, there's a 6-month period where an EDAM entity is, quote unquote, leaving the EDAM. And we're saying after that 6-month period, the EDAM access charge will essentially stop collecting and allocating, assessing to that EDAM entity. Stop collecting for it, stop assessing to it, right? Because now it's out. With the exception of the true up from the previous year. If this true up, if the EDAM entity is leaving before the end of the year, there needs to be some reconciliation for the true up to ensure that those EDAM transmission owners, ratepayers, are ultimately made whole, given that the true up is accounting for either over collection or under collection from a previous year before the EDAM entity decided to leave. And the way this would work is relatively simple. If the EDAM entity is owed at the end of the interim period, then the CAISO will distribute that balance over the rest of the calendar year, or the EDAM entity will have to essentially pay whatever it owes the EDAM transmission owners upon leaving as sort of a lump sum. So either we are providing the check at the end of the year after the CAISO has collected what would have been owed for the true up part of the access charge, or if the EDAM entity is leaving mid-year, it's paying the CAISO so that we have that to reallocate it through the access charge throughout the rest of the year. And then it would be over at the end of that calendar year for the true up. But that is it. I will pause here. This is just, this was on the, let's see, this was just on the definition and just better wording here. Like the idea of the access charge is really to balance costs and benefits, and wasn't as clear in the definition, and I think now it is. So I will pause here to see if anyone has any questions on the tariff provisions for the access charge.
There's currently no hands and no questions in the chat.
Great. Well, it's Friday. I won't belabor it, but I'll remind you, if something that does occur to you, you notice something, feel free to reach out to me individually. Happy to take your call or email. Thanks.
Okay. And then can you drag presenting rates? See if I can take it back. Yeah, Bill, if you can drag presenting rates to me, and I can, or go to the next slide, and John can wrap up. Okay. Okay, I'm going to hand it back over to John Anders for next steps.
Thanks, Elena, Bill, Milos, James, and everyone who participated in this call today. We really appreciate your time, and we hope this has been helpful, reminding everybody, refreshing things, and taking a look at the incremental changes we intend to submit. So our plan is to submit this filing before the end of March, and the reason for that is to get the certainty around this design element of EDAM for all those interested, both perhaps already committed to joining the EDAM, and others who may be seriously considering participation in the EDAM. In the near future, but also in the longer longer term, horizon. We don't have a formal, comment period noticed for these tariff revisions, like Bill said. We welcome your input, feedback, comments, questions, edits, anything you have. And you can reach out individually to those or submit things into the stakeholders address at that location there. There's other related information on the website if you need to go back to the policy. Things like the board memo and all that, of course, are on the board website and governing body website. So all this is out there and available. Again, I think we're moving forward. We're looking forward to moving along with this proposal, and we welcome any further comments. And we'll just take one last moment here, see if there's any raised hands before we wrap. I see I got Dan Williams.
We've got a hand.
Hey, thanks, John.
Dan,
This is Dan. This is Dan from the Energy Authority. It might be a question for Milos. I've been searching back through some materials while we were going through stuff and just couldn't find the answer to it. On the non-CAISO TSP side, for identifying that portion from within an EDAM area that is sort of in play here, are we trying to isolate on the loss in the truly incremental purchases of short-term transmission on those systems? And what I mean by that is, when in a formula rate context for entities with OATS, any of the entities that are network customers within the EDAM area, I'm trying to use the right words for it, of the TSP of the EDAM area, when they're purchasing short-term non-firm to make off-system sales from undesignated resources, that short-term revenue is coming back in to offset what they're allocated within their network charges, and also goes towards long-term firm. And so loss of that activity, because that activity would be happening in EDAM, isn't necessarily a loss of incremental revenues. It's a loss or a change of allocation internal to the rate structure, versus if there's a third party that's not an NT customer within those areas that's purchasing the rights, and then that activity moves into EDAM, the loss of those third party purchases are a loss of incremental revenue. Is there somewhere I can go to just to find more of kind of what's expected as far as that breakdown, or capturing the actual true pool of dollars that's at stake here for what's qualifying? Or is it just capturing every short-term non-firm sale and how much of that has gone away, regardless of whether it's incumbent customer of the TSP or a third party that is reducing those short-term non-firm or short-term firm purchases?
Thanks, Dan. This is Milos. Maybe I'll reach out to you offline and point you to a couple of sections, make sure I understood the full question. But at first blush, if I understood it, this is looking at system-wide reductions in short-term sales. I think that, I don't know if that helps, but maybe reach out to me offline to better understand the question, and I can point you in what we've put into the materials.
Yeah, just a super simple example without belaboring it is, if you have a EDAM BA and the merchant arm of that EDAM BA is their only NT customer, and they're currently participating in the CAISO intertie market to trade with CAISO day ahead, they would be purchasing short-term rights or potentially longer-term rights so that they can undesignate network resources and interact with the CAISO market in the day ahead. Those sales are just going back to offset the revenue requirement that they're already paying, so they're not really incremental. But if some third party comes in and wheels across their system, that's incremental revenue that may end up in being facilitated now through EDAM that has gone away. So it's trying to differentiate between sort of where these buckets of dollars are coming from, as to understand the magnitude a little bit better, since we don't have estimates at this point of what is going to be kind of in play to be pushed around between the areas to levelize through this charge.
Yeah, no, good question. I think I understand it better. I think in the design, we noted that this is not associated with those types of merchant transactions, but focused on the third-party revenues associated with the short-term products. And I'll find it here in the design, and I'll send it your way. Maybe shoot me an email just to make sure I have your latest email address. But I'll point you in the right direction.
Okay, thanks, and thanks for letting me take a little more time there.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
Okay, well, not seeing any more hands, I'll turn it back to Yelena or the event producer.
Okay, so we're just gonna wrap this up and say thank you everybody for attending, and we're gonna end this meeting. Thank you.